60 years ago, Nevada killed the exact oasis that gave Las Vegas its name, drained it dry, wiped out species found nowhere else on Earth, and buried the evidence under casinos and parking lots. Then the state tried something almost nobody expected, rebuilding that dead oasis from scratch, in the middle of one of the driest cities in America. What came back wasn't just water, it was extinct animals, buried ancient homes, a collapsing ecosystem forced back to life, and a final discovery so strange even the scientists who built it are still trying to explain it. This is that story. What the springs actually were. Geologists call the formation a cienega, a desert wetland fed from below by an aquifer buried deep under the valley floor. During the last ice age, this entire basin was wet and green. Aerial reconstructions show marshland stretching across ground that is now parking lots and freeways. Columbian mammoths walked here. Ancient bison, camels, and horses grazed the shallows. When the glaciers retreated and the climate warmed, roughly 12,000 years ago, the marsh shrank. But the springs held on, pushing water to the surface long after the rest of the desert had dried out completely. That water drew people, and it never stopped. Archaeologists have found evidence of Native Americans using these springs at least 5,000 years ago. By around the year 1100, the southern Paiute, the Nuuvi, had established a lasting presence across southern Nevada, building gardens and settlements near the springs and the washes that ran from them. This water wasn't a convenience, it was survival in one of the harshest environments in North America. Then, the outsiders arrived. In 1829, a scout named Rafael Rivera became the first non-native person known to reach the springs, breaking away from a trading caravan to find them. 15 years later, explorer John C. Fremont camped here with frontiersman Kit Carson, and Fremont's written account of the place spread. Word that in the middle of a brutal desert, there was one reliable stop where a traveler could rest and water their animals. Spanish explorers who later passed through gave the valley a name built around what they saw: grassy meadows in the middle of nowhere. Las Vegas. The meadows. The water let people stay, not just pass through. Mormon missionaries built the first permanent settlement on the site in 1855. A rancher named Octavius Decatur Gass took over the land and grew crops in open desert on the strength of the springs. The property later passed to Helen Stewart, who ran the ranch for years after her husband was murdered, becoming one of the most important early figures in the valley's history. Historians keep landing on the same point. It was the water. Without it, nobody stops here, nobody builds here, and Las Vegas never exists at all. There used to be a fish and a frog living in that water too. A silver minnow called the Las Vegas dace, found nowhere else on Earth, and the Vegas Valley leopard frog, an amphibian built for a desert oasis. Remember both? They matter later. How a 15,000-year system died in 60 years. For most of human history, the springs balanced themselves. Water went in through rain and snowmelt on the surrounding mountains, traveled slowly through the aquifer, and came back out at the surface. Then, in 1905, the railroad arrived, and the town of Las Vegas was officially born. 2 years later, someone drilled the first flowing well straight into the aquifer. That well was a warning sign nobody read as one. A flowing well felt like magic. Drill down, and pressurized water rose on its own, no pump required. It seemed like the valley had an endless supply. So more wells were drilled, then more. Each one pulled from the same underground reservoir feeding the natural springs. At its peak, that system had discharged an estimated 7,500 acre-feet of water a year. Billions of gallons, feeding meadows across the valley floor. The clock was already ticking. The valley just couldn't hear it yet. Through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, groundwater pumping accelerated as the city grew. Underground, the pressure that had pushed water to the surface for 15,000 years began to drop, slowly, then not slowly. As the water table fell, it severed the connection between the deep aquifer and the surface springs, starving them from below, while almost nobody in the growing city could see it happening. The wildlife saw it first. The last confirmed record of the Las Vegas dace came in 1943. After that, nothing. A fish that survived 15,000 years of desert, gone in a single human lifetime. By the 1950s, the Vegas Valley leopard frog had followed it into extinction, becoming one of the first amphibians in North America believed to be wiped out entirely. Then, in 1962, the springs stopped. Not slowed, stopped. The water that defined this valley for 15,000 years no longer reached the surface at all. The meadows that gave Las Vegas its name dried and died. The city existed only because of that water. Its name, its founding, its first settlers, all of it traced back to the springs. And the city drank them dry inside of 60 years. What followed was silence. In 1978, the historic springs and old waterworks buildings were listed on the National Register of Historic Places, a quiet acknowledgement that something important had happened here. But the water itself was gone, and as far as the city was concerned, it was never coming back. For 60 years, that was the whole story. A cautionary tale with no second act. Rebuilding an oasis by hand. The turn came at the start of a new century. In 2000, the Las Vegas Valley Water District began habitat restoration on the land where the springs once flowed. They couldn't restore the natural springs. The aquifer connection was gone, the water table too low, so they decided to rebuild the oasis by hand instead. Construction on what would become the Springs Preserve began in 2005. The project eventually cost around $250 million and covered 180 acres, roughly 3 miles west of the downtown casinos. On June 8, 2007, it opened to the public, and what they built was more than a memorial. It functioned as a living ecosystem. Engineers and biologists recreated 3 acres of wetland, complete with a flowing stream and 6 habitat ponds, reconstructing portions of the historic Las Vegas Creek that had run dry decades earlier. They replanted native mesquite, willow, and grasses that had once framed the natural springs and routed in carefully managed water to feed it. Piece by piece, on the exact ground where the desert had reclaimed everything, a wetland came back. Building a wetland is one thing. Getting life to return to it is another matter entirely. And this is where the story starts to turn strange. The first residents arrived in 2015 when biologists created a 15-acre habitat for the threatened desert tortoise. Among them was one that became genuinely famous, Mojave Max, a living tortoise who emerges from his burrow each spring. For more than 25 years, his emergence has marked the unofficial start of consistent warm weather in Clark County, with elementary school students across the region submitting guesses each year for the exact day and time he'll appear. The contest has run since 2000, the kind of detail that tells you this restoration became more than a science project. It became part of the city's identity. But the tortoise was the easy part. Tortoises still lived in the surrounding desert. The real question was whether the preserve could bring back the things that had actually gone extinct here. The fish, the frog, the return of the extinct. It couldn't. Not exactly. And this is the part of the story that separates honest conservation from a feel-good headline. The original Las Vegas dace was extinct, gone since the 1940s, preserved only as museum specimens. It could never swim in these waters again. The original Vegas Valley leopard frog was extinct too, so biologists did the next best thing available to them. They found the closest living relatives that could fill the same ecological role and released them into the restored refugium ponds. In 2018, they released the Pahrump poolfish, a federally endangered fish with its own dramatic backstory. Decades earlier, as the poolfish's original spring was being pumped dry, the late University of Nevada professor James Deacon reportedly scooped a bucket of them out of the vanishing water and moved them to safety. That bucket may have saved the species. Now, 60 years after fish had last lived in the Las Vegas spring system, fish were swimming there again. Alongside them came the relict leopard frog, and this animal's history is almost hard to believe. In the 1950s, it was thought to be completely extinct, believed by some to be the first extinct amphibian in North America. Then, in the early 1990s, it turned up alive near Lake Mead, a frog written off as gone for 40 years, still breathing in the desert. This isn't a resurrection, it's a substitution. Proxies standing in for the endemics that will never return, holding the ecological role open, keeping the system whole. Biologists have a word for it: rewilding. And it worked. Hundreds of tadpoles were moved from the refugium ponds into the larger recreated wetland in 2021 and 2022. By 2023, A new self-sustaining population of relic leopard frogs had established itself there, with surveys counting dozens of adults and juveniles thriving in water that hadn't existed 20 years earlier. Nocturnal surveys that year documented frogs breeding entirely on their own, with the refugium pond population estimated at around 100 adults. Fish reproduced, frogs multiplied. Managing it wasn't simple. Biologists discovered the relic leopard frogs would cannibalize their own young, forcing the team to rethink pond management to keep the population climbing instead of eating itself back down. Ray Smrekar, the senior environmental biologist who has led much of the species work here, put the goal in plain terms. There used to be a frog and a fish in this system, and the point is simply to make that true again. Keeping a single species alive, he said, is part of keeping the whole ecosystem intact. If a bucket of fish and a frog everyone had given up on can turn a parking lot into a living wetland, it's worth seeing what else this channel has dug up about the species fighting to survive across the American landscape. That's exactly what we cover every week, so if this is the kind of story you want more of, now's a good moment to subscribe before we get to what's happening 90 miles away. A bigger fight across the desert. The Springs Preserve is one piece of a much larger fight playing out across the Nevada desert, and some of it is happening right now. 90 miles from the city sits a place biologists call the Galapagos of the Mojave. Ash Meadows National Wildlife Refuge covers just under 24,000 acres and holds 26 species found nowhere else on Earth. The second greatest concentration of unique species in North America, clustered around roughly 50 desert springs and seeps. As the region dried out 10,000 years ago, aquatic creatures survived by retreating into shrinking pockets of water, isolating for millennia until they evolved into entirely new species. Ash Meadows is what the Las Vegas Springs might have become, had they been protected instead of pumped. Inside that refuge lives one of the rarest fish on the planet, the Devil's Hole pupfish, a tiny electric blue fish confined to a single water-filled limestone cavern. Its recent story shows how fragile these systems remain. In spring 2025, a survey counted only 38 of these fish, down from 191 a year earlier. 2 earthquakes had sent waves through the normally still water, washing eggs and food off the shallow shelf the fish depend on, briefly dropping the population to around 20 individuals, the kind of number that makes conservationists lie awake at night. For the first time, biologists released captive-bred fish into the cavern to reinforce them. Then something turned. The spring 2026 count tallied 77 pupfish, nearly 4 times the year before, with the fish reproducing again and several hundred more held in a backup facility as insurance against the next disaster. Here's the detail almost everyone outside Nevada missed. The same city that drained its founding springs has quietly become one of the most water-conscious places in the country. Facing a shrinking Colorado River supply, the Southern Nevada Water Authority cut regional water use per person by roughly 55% between 2002 and 2024, paying people to tear out grass lawns and capping usage even as the population kept climbing. It doesn't undo what happened to the springs, nothing can. But it means the mistake taught something. The threats aren't over. Conservationists have warned that exploratory drilling and a proposed lithium mine near Ash Meadows could endanger the very endemic species that survived everything else. Every spring, every seep, every cavern pool still sits at the intersection of a growing region's thirst and a set of species that cannot live anywhere else on the planet. What was buried beneath the water? There's one more layer to what the Springs Preserve uncovered, and it isn't water. As biologists rebuilt the wetland above ground, archaeologists worked below it, documenting and partially excavating a pit house dating to roughly the year 700, a dwelling left behind by ancestral people who lived beside these springs more than 13 centuries ago. They recovered chipped stone tools, ceramics, shells, and charcoal, and used ground-penetrating radar to map 2 more likely buried dwellings without disturbing the soil. The water here was reliable enough that people built homes beside it 1,300 years ago. Those homes sat buried under the same ground where a modern city later drilled the springs dry, and now a rebuilt wetland runs on top of both. 3 chapters of the same story stacked on one patch of desert. The people who needed the water, the city that spent it, and the restoration that finally admitted the debt. What actually came back? So, what actually came back to the desert? 3 acres of open wetland and a running stream where 60 years of dry ground used to be. Fish swimming in a system that had been fishless since the 1940s. Frogs, an animal once written off as North America's first extinct amphibian, now breeding on its own in a wetland engineers built from scratch. More than 30 species of birds arriving with no invitation, following the water the way birds have followed water for millions of years. Tortoises digging burrows that shelter dozens of other animals. Coyotes, bobcats, and foxes moving through at night. A critically endangered wildflower, blooming where it was never planted. None of it is the original Oasis. The endemic dace and the endemic frog are gone for good, and honesty demands saying so. But standing at the edge of that rebuilt wetland, watching a leopard frog that science had once declared extinct rest on a lily pad, in water that didn't exist 20 years ago, in the middle of one of the driest cities in America, the word that keeps coming up is the only one that fits. Unreal. The Las Vegas Springs taught the world a lesson the hard way. You can drain 15,000 years of water in the span of a single lifetime, and some of what you lose in the process never comes back. The dace is proof of that. So is the Vegas Valley frog. But the rebuilt Oasis teaches the other half of the lesson, that when a place decides its own history is worth restoring, the desert is more forgiving than it looks. Put the water back, and life returns. Not all of it, not the way it was, but enough to matter, enough to prove that an ending isn't always the end. The springs that built Las Vegas are still gone. What replaced them is something stranger, and in some ways braver. A city looking hard at the thing it destroyed, and choosing, decades too late, but not too late to mean something, to build it back. That's the legacy of the Las Vegas Springs, and it's still being written today. And if you want to be there for the next chapter, whatever desert this channel digs into next, subscribing is the easiest way to catch it.